Elden Ring is the freshest entry in FromSoft's fantastic Souls series. It's been a few months since the title released, and I've played as much as I could since it dropped. After experiencing as much as I could with the game, I have gathered a number of thoughts relating to this installment. When it comes to doing these reviews, I focus on 5 aspects I feel are crucial to any game. The top 3 elements being a game's story, gameplay, and music, and the secondary elements being graphics and replayability. My review will be divided into 2 parts. Part A is an objective as possible review of what the game has to offer, and Part B, my own thoughts and feelings with the experiences that I had with the game. Naturally, there's going to be bias in any review, such as some journalists struggling with difficulty while others just merely hate the concept of water, but I'll do what I can to curb any of that from coming through. With that out of the way, let's get started. Elden Ring takes place in the lands between, beneath the Great Erd Tree, a very Nordic-inspired world with lands ranging from verdant fields to snowy peaks. The overall premise is you, the Tarnished, need to seek out great runes and play very powerful demigods in order to complete the Elden Ring. If the Tarnished manages to accomplish this task, then they are able to become the Elden Lord. And that's about the extent of all the story they're going to give. Much like every other Souls game, the story is not dynamic, and most players are either going to be confused or just not care. Despite this being the case, ironically enough, Elden Ring is probably the one title in the franchise whose story is most in your face. But that's only in relation to the story that they themselves serve you. A lot of information relating to the world and characters is hidden away behind side quests and gear flavor text. Most of the time, the player is required to follow a guide in order to progress a questline, because the requirements for not only finding these side quests is difficult, but learning the next steps in the quest is typically just as difficult. For example, our character will tell you to visit location A and seek person B so you can get item C. But the process of going about this game of hide and seek is tedious because you have no idea where exactly to go. It's not an issue that most of the world building is tucked away in weapons and armor. It even offers a fun game of piecing the puzzle together to gain a greater grasp of the world. But the way you go about interacting with NPCs is archaic. It's very reminiscent of older JRPGs that had missable content. At any point in your journey, you could screw yourself out of a missable all because you ended up triggering a cutscene you weren't supposed to. It's a very not good feeling, especially in a game that doesn't offer save states. This sentiment being amplified even more considering how open the world of Elden Ring is. Most areas in other Souls titles were typically extravagant hallways that would tether you between areas, making exploration much easier when it came to finding NPCs. The vastness of Elden Ring makes this an incredibly arduous process. With that said, Elden Ring has the richest lore and world building out of any entry in the series, even if most of its endings are pretty inconsequential to the overall story being told. If you enjoy tying all the strings together on your own and forming your own conclusions of the world, you'll love what Elden Ring has to offer. Otherwise, you'll probably be best off checking out channels of people who love devoting themselves to this kind of content. Overall, I'd say Elden Ring has fantastic lore with a poor presentation of story. The gameplay of Elden Ring is more or less what you would expect from a Souls title. To make it extremely simple, you either play with close range weapons or with magic. You do have the option to play with supplementary weapons such as bows, but the game really isn't catered around that kind of playstyle. Even though it's possible to beat even the hardest character in this game with these gimmicky builds, it's typically not worth the effort. I'm going to start with the cons of Elden Ring's gameplay, because I feel like they were more prevalent in my playthrough. Now, the core of the gameplay loop is to avoid the enemy's attacks and strike when the opportunity presents itself. And this brings me to my first problem with Elden Ring's gameplay. The enemies attack so often that more often than not, you're literally just strafing around looking for that one window to attack. That window, more often than not, is extremely small, and you're only able to get a hit or two in. If you're using a faster weapon, you may be able to get a few more hits in, but the overall back and forth is more in favor of whatever boss you're fighting. I saw a very apt tweet that described Elden Ring as a Dark Souls character that got trapped in a game with Bloodborne and Sekiro bosses, and I could not agree more. The playable character is so slow that most fights feel almost as if you're playing underwater. Most of the time, that one chance you have to attack, you'll just do a jumping attack, since that's typically your fastest, strongest, and safest option, which, of course, makes the game a lot less interesting when you're only punishing with one thing because all your other options are just bad. My next bad point about Elden Ring is the input reading because it is egregious. You can find all kinds of videos of this in action, and it is going to happen to you if you play. The bosses always read your inputs, but it's especially noticeable when they start pacing about. Any kind of action you take will elicit a response from them in this time, which is how they generally screw a lot of players over when they're looking for an opening to heal. Even when the boss is finished with their attacks, they're still prepared to attack you based on what you do, and that's something I just can't get behind. If there was input reading in Souls games pre-Elden Ring, I honestly didn't notice it because it wasn't this bad. It could be fine in some scenarios, but the fact that it's something that's ever present was just a really terrible design decision. The next thing I'm going to talk about is by far the worst thing in this game by a long shot, and I honestly don't hear enough people talking about it. Elden Ring has a terrible button input problem. There's always been a bit of lag between when you press a button and when the game registers that input, but that buffer time has never really been an issue once you've gotten used to it. The input buffering is essentially the same, but I can only assume it has something to do with the input loss. For example, you know the boss is about to attack you, so you prepare to roll. You hit the button, but nothing happens and you promptly end up dead because of it. Then you're just left saying, "Come on, I rolled!" And you might pass it off as maybe your reaction speed wasn't fast enough. But in actuality, you probably did hit that button when you were supposed to. But the game just didn't take notice. This extends to every single action you take. Rolling, switching weapons, attacking. Elden Ring loves eating your inputs, and that's a de facto problem in a game that requires precision. The more fun aspects of Elden Ring's gameplay is discovering the plethora of different weapons that are available. They introduced a new system that allows you to really customize your weapon abilities via Ashes of War. My only gripe is that swapping these skills around directly affects the element associated with it, but that's just a small thing. If you really like using a weapon, like the God Skin Peeler for example, but dislike the inherent weapon art associated with it, you can just change it. There are some limitations of what can be swapped around, but for the most part, there's a pretty large range of available options. Well, as long as you use a melee weapon anyway. Most of the ranged weapons get screwed out of this system. Despite a lot of the flaws mentioned previously, the bosses are still enjoyable for the most part, getting their patterns down, learning what you can and can't parry, knowing what's a safe option versus what isn't. All good stuff when things are working properly. With that, I've got to dock Elden Ring in the gameplay department hard. There's just too much wrong to offset what it does right. Elden Ring's soundtrack is beautiful and powerful. There were quite a few composers who worked on this title, perhaps to match the scale of the world they were building. Dark Souls 3's main composer, Yuki Kitamura, returned to work on this entry as well as Bloodborne's Tsukasa Saito and newcomers Yoshimi Kudo, Shoei Miyazawa, and Tai Tomisawa. The music is often very subtle when you're exploring the world, mostly adding ambiance to your environment, but it always feels like it belongs. This type of environmental music does a great job in helping paint the landscape. It's never obtrusive, and most of the time you don't even notice it's there, until you get to boss fights. This is when the music ramps up, strings start violently getting bowed, the choir kicks in, and everything becomes much more epic. And while you might not get to really appreciate the music in the moment, as you're most likely going to be getting washed around by whatever boss at the time, it's always a treat to hear again on subsequent playthroughs, or if you're just listening to the OST on whatever platform. The music truly heightens the experience of playing Elden Ring. The composers and musicians all did an exemplary job. The graphics in Elden Ring are great. We've come a long way since Demon's Souls and Dark Souls. You can still make goofy looking characters, but now you actually have the option to make hot characters, which is a pretty big step up. Beyond that, the world just looks great. When you come crawling out of that dark, dank hole and see the whole world before you, it's just beautiful. It's like if a Xenoblade game ran on actually powerful hardware and let you see the full beauty of the land before you. On launch for PC, the game ran like ass for a whole lot of different specs, but they finally ironed it out so most users could actually enjoy it. On launch for PC, the game ran very poorly for a whole lot of different specs, but they finally ironed it out so most users could enjoy the experience. Now, I'm uploading this months after that, so if you get this on PC, you're basically going to be okay unless you have pretty outdated hardware. I definitely recommend getting this on a next-gen console or PC for the best gameplay experience, and if those aren't options to you, then the last-gen options at the very least run smoothly at about 30 FPS. Elden Ring's replayability is middling at best. The game reuses a lot of bosses throughout the entire run, so on one playthrough you've most likely already had your fill. Especially when you just want to get to a unique boss or a boss you like, but you've got to jump through a bunch of different hurdles to fight whatever mini-boss may be blocking your path. The best you're going to get going through a New Game Plus experience is using different kinds of builds for your runs or trying out different side quests that you might have missed. Since the game lets you respec essentially whenever you want, you don't even need multiple playthroughs for different PvP builds. Ultimately, it comes down to how much you enjoy the game and want to hop into another playthrough. Elden Ring is like a delectable pie that just got pulled from the oven. But when you cut into it, you notice that the ingredients haven't finished cooking. The framework was there for it to be the best entry, but they didn't leave it in the oven long enough. If you're really interested in playing it, I'd recommend waiting for a sale to really get your money's worth. Overall, it's a very solid game that's sure to challenge you, with hours upon hours of content. And with that, I give Elden Ring 4 furled fingers out of 5. Alright, so this is going to be my personal thoughts on Elden Ring, so we're completely off script. Everything I'm going to say is basically my feelings, my own personal thoughts. I was really disappointed by Elden Ring. I really, really wanted to like it. Like, I really did. I love Dark Souls 1 and 3. 2, but you know, I enjoyed it enough. I loved Bloodborne. I loved Sekiro, and I really wanted to love Elden Ring. I tried my best, but it just drove me insane. And I don't mean in a this game's hard kind of way. I mean, there's just so many technical things that are maddening. And I mentioned it in the review, that the button loss, oh my god, there were so many times where I would go to do an attack, or I would go to roll, and I would just die for it, just because the game just didn't want to register the button properly. And that drove me insane. But at first, you don't really notice it. Like, I didn't really start noticing until I got near the end of the game. And in part, maybe it was because the latter half of the game is actually pretty boring. At that point, you know, enemies, they just become just giant sponges of bullshit, and it's really exhausting in a way to do the last area of Elden Ring. And that, compounded with the button loss, just it really disappointed me. Not to mention boss aggression. Oh my god. So annoying. Constantly feeling the pressure from these bosses. Constantly looking for these tiny moments where you can actually play the game. I think that's just such a huge problem, because the game doesn't really equip you with the means to deal with these bosses. The best thing you could probably do is, the best thing you could probably do just simply is parry. Just learn everything you can parry. And that is probably the most consistent way to inflict damage. And then, they give you some tools like Quick Step or Bloodhound Step, but like, those moves are, they do offer more iframes in movement and more distance, and the distance you travel when like you would do a roll, right? But sometimes they just don't work. Not only in a sense that, button loss, but in the sense that you press a button in a direction and it will not take you in that direction. So there's that. So there are actually skills that just don't work quite how they should. And it's just if it were just a few small things, it would be okay. But I know this sounds like a rant, but I'm just really disappointed, because by all means, Elden Ring, I especially do love the world. Level design leaves much to be desired. There's a handful of good, like, dungeons and areas. They're all certainly very impressive visually, but really, like, the main one that comes to my mind that was really good was Stormvale Castle, which is the first main dungeon you get to. And then after that, it really peters off pretty bad. Um, and then a majority of your dungeons are like caves. Just reused caves throughout the world with a bunch of bosses that have been reused God knows how many times. It's just so disappointing. Like truly, Elden Ring, I really suffered under the weight of its own size. It was literally too big for its own good. And I think they knew that. That's why they reused so many assets. And like, it's not really an issue, especially like on your first playthrough. But like when you're exploring and you're like, oh, I need a cave, and then you fight the same boss that you fought 3 to 4 times before, like, oh, okay, and you're just a bit disappointed. And then you beat the boss and you get an item that is completely irrelevant to you most of the time, and you're just like, huh, well, this is a waste of however long this took. And yeah. One thing I want to talk about is how disappointing the magic is in Elden Ring. Like, magic's improved between each game, and Elden Ring had some interesting spells, but a lot of those spells really lack an identity. A lot of them are just rehashes of older spells from older games, and none of them, outside of really a handful, are like, this is Elden Ring's magic. Like, they inherited basically the soul arrows, pyromancies, dragon abilities, and that's what I mean. Like, it's like, is this really just another Souls game? Or I thought this was Elden Ring. I thought this was Elden Ring. I thought this was Elden Ring. You know, where are the unique spells that really say this is Elden Ring? And there might be a few, but they are far in between. And they really did away with like specialization. So like a lot of spells end up wanting you to spec into like faith and int and arcane to use them. So like instead of just being like, I'm the int man, I'm the int faith arcane man. And that kind of, it's a bit disappointing if you want to do a magic build. Not to mention, if we're getting into, you know, the gameplay, spell scaling is cheeks. It is bad. For a long time, your spells just aren't going to do anything. Variable cast speed is an interesting thing that they added, but it doesn't offer a significant enough difference, because a majority of your spells are worthless. They, and also in a way it kind of breaks the game with a few spells, such as Comet, which is the main go-to for most spellcasters that aren't using like a super cheese build that requires a lot of setup and prep. And it's just really boring because you pop Comet, the enemy, because it's a delayed spell. Most enemies will, because of the input reading, will just jump out of the way of nothing because it's delayed, and then they'll get hit by the comets. And you just do this ad nauseum for every single boss in the entire game, just about. And it's such a shame. And like I said, like they added like madness and like blood spells, which might be the closest thing to an identity Elden Ring has, but a majority of them are just disappointing. Like the coolest one is like an eye laser, but it's pretty weak. It's more useful in like PvP than it is in actual PvE. So yeah. And like they could have done more. Like it's so apparent that they put all of their energy and time into Ashes of War and physical weapons, that just about every other weapon type is just like pushed to the side. And like, you know, you can look around and like you'll see a lot of people who like the mage builds are relatively disappointed. And yeah, I really hope that they improve this in the next game. So, because a lot of people don't. One of the best parts about the Souls games is you can have all kinds of builds and do all kinds of things, but it's like they really want you to not do those things in this one. They really want you to say, here's a sword, here's a shield, or alternatively, here's another sword. Go have fun. Go do things. And you're sitting there like, but I have this staff. I want to do cool things. And it's like, oh, you know, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't, bud. You know, that might not be the best option, but do you, you know, put 60 into int and still barely scratch the boss. You know, it's stuff like that. I really wanted to bring that up because I've seen people complain about it. So yeah, it's really sad that my favorite part of the game is just, it's pretty. Like that's not good. That's not, a game can't just be pretty, you know. It's super shallow, it's super hollow. But it is what it is. I really hope that in Elden Ring 2 or Dark Souls 4, whatever the heck they plan on doing next, that they really iron out some of these issues. Because I've never felt disappointed playing one of these titles. Like never. Like even though like Dark Souls 2 isn't my favorite, I still like enjoyed it. But this one just left a bad taste in my mouth. Truly. I do want to say, because I don't want to just be negative, I do want to say that they really did a fantastic job trying to build the world, if that makes sense. Like, the lore runs deep in this game. Like, I'm talking deep. Sigils, flowers, just all kinds of things that help to shape the world. And that's what I was saying. Like, if you're really into that stuff, then you will love Elden Ring. Because, wow. Unfortunately, I'm not. I always enjoy watching other people talk about it, so I understand what the heck is going on. But like, I'm gonna butcher their name, but Shinjinwei, I think that's how you say it, aka Qualag Kellogg on YouTube. They do fantastic lore videos. Same with VodiVidya. You know, all these people that really get into the lore and the story that isn't told. And I think that that they did a really fantastic job with this one in that regard. So like, I will absolutely 100% give them props for that. And with that, for me personally, I'd give this game a 2 out of 5. Like, I've beaten it once. I'm probably never going to go back to it. And yeah, that's a bit of a shame. Alright. Thanks for watching the video. Please like, subscribe, comment, 5 stars. This, that, the third, whatever you want to do. If you've made it this far, really just thank you for watching. And with that, have a wonderful day.